Good morning everybody, Mr. R here. Time for another story time. And today we're going to do something a little bit differently because I'm not going to tell you a story from my box, from my story box, because I've been having quite a few children asking me whether I can tell a different type of story. And I don't know whether you remember, but right at the very beginning when I started telling stories, I told you that my stories really come from two places. They come from my story box, which I found in the Tate Gallery, or they come from my head. Things that happen to me. These are all true stories. All my stories are true. But some of the stories that I tell happen to me. Things that happened to me when I was younger, things that happened to me when I lived in different countries. And I'm going to tell you one of those stories today. And it's a story that I think a lot of you are going to know, that I've taught before, because it's a story called Broccoli. And I'm going to tell you the first time that I met broccoli. And you might be thinking to yourself, broccoli is a vegetable. And it's true, broccoli is a vegetable, but broccoli is the name of the little person in my story today. And I'm going to tell you how I met him. So before I lived in Canada, I lived in England. That's where I grew up. But before I lived in England, I lived in another country called Austria. And Austria is a country in Europe. And it's a country that in some ways is very similar to Canada because they have very cold, long winters with lots of snow. And their summers are normally very nice too, just like our summers can often be too. And my story starts in the winter time, in the middle of winter actually, when the snow was thick on the ground. And I lived in a house, I was very lucky, I lived in a house that had a huge bedroom window. And this bedroom window went from the ceiling all the way down to the ground. And I could look out of my bedroom window into my garden. And I had a very big garden, and at the back there were some bushes and there were trees growing in the garden, and I had some garden boxes, but of course they were covered in snow. And during the summer I had cut down a couple of the trees that had been old and were rotting. And so I was left with tree stumps that were about this high off the ground. And they were kind of towards the back of my garden. And one day I woke up in the morning and I looked out of my window and someone was sitting on one of the tree stumps. And because the tree stumps were at the back of the garden, I couldn't see clearly who it was. So I reached for my binoculars and looked through my binoculars, and there, sitting on the tree stump, was what looked like a little person. Now, my first thought was that this little person was my neighbour's boy, because my neighbour had a 2-year-old boy, and he was often playing tricks on me and making me laugh. And I thought that he'd got dressed up and was sitting on the tree stump, because when I looked very carefully through my binoculars, whoever it was sitting on my tree stump had a super bright jacket on and black pants and big black boots. And I wonder whether my neighbour was dressed up as a little elf and was playing a trick on me. So I kind of was laughing as I got dressed and went outside and started walking towards the tree stump. But as I got closer and closer to the tree stump, the little boy who lives next door to me didn't move at all. And as I got closer, I stopped and I looked very carefully at this little person on my tree stump because I was that much closer. And this little person had a big red hat that came all the way down his back. And when I looked at his jacket, it was extremely bright. It was kind of like a rainbow jacket, every colour of the rainbow, but some colours I'd never seen before. And he had black pants on and he had a big buckle with black boots. And he had his head in his hand, so I couldn't see his face clearly. And I still thought it was my neighbour's boy, so I called out to him. And this little person looked up at me. And I knew straight away it wasn't my neighbour's boy at all, because this little person looked quite old. He had a beard, and his beard was quite long. It came down his chin and kind of finished around about where his belt buckle was. And his skin was wrinkly. And I remember his very, very bright blue eyes. And we looked at each other, and I could see that this little man was very frightened. And he, without taking his eyes off me, he put his hands on the edge of the tree stump and he started pushing himself towards the edge. And then suddenly he jumped off the tree stump and landed in the snow. And it was quite funny watching him, actually, looking back, because the snow was deep and he was so small that he disappeared up to his waist. But he very quickly shuffled himself up to the top of the snow and he ran to the back of the garden. And what surprised me at that time was how fast he could run, because he was running, even though he was only about this size, he was running as fast as a deer could run. And I called after him, but he wouldn't stop, and he squeezed through the bushes at the back of my garden and disappeared. So I couldn't just not do anything, so I followed his little footprints to the back of the garden, and I squeezed through the bushes, and I just saw his bright jacket disappear up the path on the mountain, and I was able to follow his footprints. The little person, the little man we call him at the moment, had crossed over a road on his way, but luckily there was no traffic around. It was a very, very quiet road. I don't know whether he'd looked to see whether there was anything coming, but anyway, there he was disappearing up the side of the mountain. And I followed his footprints. I had no idea where he was now because he was that much faster than I was. But it was easy to see his footprints in the snow. And he was zigzagging up the mountain. He was doing these big sweeping curves. And as we got into the trees, it got harder to see his footprints. And then something made me think, I haven't put my boots on. I couldn't believe it. I first noticed it because my feet seemed really wet, and I'd been so excited to get out into the garden that I'd forgotten to put my winter boots on, and I was actually walking in my bed socks. And when I looked down at my feet of course were soaking wet. My bed socks were really thick, but they weren't going to keep my feet dry and warm. And when I pulled off one of my socks, my toes were already turning red, and I realised that I would have to go back and get my boots. So I turned around and I came back down again. I hadn't gone too far, and I squeezed back through the bushes and went into my house to get my boots. And then all of a sudden a voice from upstairs said to me, "Mr. R, you're going to be late for school." And I realised it was a school day. I was teaching in this country at the time, and I had to be in school. And I had to forget about the little man because I had to get ready for school. And of course during the day it snowed quite heavily, and so there was no way that I could follow his footprints when I got back home again. But I was thinking about the little man for most of the day as I taught my class of children. I really hoped this little person would come back again because I wanted to find out more about him. So the following day I thought I was quite clever, because what I did was first of all I set my alarm clock for early in the morning just in case I didn't wake up. It happened to be a weekend, so it was a Saturday, so I didn't have to worry about missing him or getting back for something. And I actually put my boots at the end of the bed and I slept in my clothes, thinking that it would be that much quicker for me just to jump up, put my boots on and go out into the garden. I seem to remember I didn't sleep very well that night because I was quite excited. And when my alarm clock went off in the morning, I reached for my binoculars and looked through them. And sure enough, there he was again, at the back of my garden, in exactly the same place, on the tree stump, with his head in his hands, looking down at the ground. And I got out of bed, I slipped my boots on, and I went out into the snow. As I walked towards him, I stopped because I didn't want to frighten him, and I called out, as quietly as I could to get his attention, and again he looked up, and exactly the same thing happened. Apart from this time, just as he was about to push himself off the tree stump, he sneezed really loudly. And I remember kind of laughing, thinking it was quite funny, because his sneeze was so loud that when he fell down into the snow, he seemed to disappear even higher before he managed to get himself to the top and run off to the back of my garden again. I didn't call after him this time because I knew he was just going to run from me, so I followed him. I had my boots, I had my winter jacket, I was warmly dressed, and I didn't think there was going to be any problem. But as I got higher up the mountain, the clouds came over the mountain, and it wasn't long before it started snowing. And it was snowing pretty heavily. I wasn't too worried about getting cold, but of course, what do you think happened to his footprints? You probably guessed it. It wasn't long before his footprints had completely disappeared and I had nothing left to follow. I couldn't keep on going up the mountain because I probably would have ended up getting lost in the snowstorm. So I had to turn around and come back, and I was super disappointed. When I got home, I didn't tell anybody in my house what had been happening. For some reason, I felt it best to keep it a secret, and I didn't even think anybody would believe me anyway. So I came back home, and that day I did my chores around the house and outside and met a couple of friends, but I couldn't stop thinking about this little man, and I wondered, would he be back for a third time? Exactly the same thing happened. I set my alarm clock that night. I went to bed in my clothes. I left my boots and my winter jacket at the end of the bed. And when I woke up in the morning and looked out of my window, there he was for the third time. I thought to myself, nothing can go wrong this time. As I walked out into the garden, I was warmly dressed. I'd even made myself a sandwich and put it in my winter jacket pocket. When I looked up at the sky was blue. There was no chance it was going to snow today, and I'd looked at the weather forecast. I didn't even stop as I walked towards the tree stump because the little man heard my footprints in the snow, and he jumped from the tree stump and ran again quickly to the back of the garden and disappeared. I followed him up the mountain. Higher and higher we went. It was really easy to see his little footprints in the snow, even though they were very small. And eventually, I got to the top of the mountain. And the top of the mountain is rather a strange place. I'd been up there lots in the summer. It's strange because you have to be very careful. It's a dangerous place. Because when you get to the top, there's a cliff that just drops all the way down. And there are bushes along the top that are covered in snow. So you have to be careful you don't get too close to the edge. But when you see the bushes that are covered in snow, you know not to go too much further. The footprints stopped at the bushes. And I couldn't understand why they just finished there by the bushes. So I looked around, and my first thought was the little man had been very clever. He got to the bushes, realised he couldn't go any further, and then he'd stepped backwards in his footprints and was hiding from me. So the first thing I did was turn around and I started looking in the trees. I thought he would be easy to see because of his jacket. So I looked in all of the trees around where his footprints finished, but he didn't seem to be hiding from me anywhere. So I walked back a little bit further and started looking behind trees, thinking that he was standing behind a tree, but I couldn't see him. All the while I was trying to talk, just in case he was frightened of me, but there was nothing. And I remember sitting down and leaning against a tree and eating part of my sandwich, thinking about where he could have gone. And I started looking at the bushes again. And when I'd finished my sandwich, I walked back over to the bushes and I looked again at his footprints. And when I looked really carefully, there was what looked like a rabbit hole where his footprints had finished. But this hole was for a bigger animal. I really didn't want to go back down the mountain without looking a bit further. So I took my jacket off and I hung it up on a branch. and I got down as low as I could and I squeezed into this hole. Now I knew that I had to be very careful because on the other side of the bushes was the cliff that came all the way down, and the last thing I wanted to do was fall down the cliff. So I crawled really slowly through the bush, and I couldn't see his footprints anymore, but I had a feeling as I got further into the bushes that this was where he'd come. Now something very strange happened, because I seemed to be crawling for a long time and I hadn't come to the other side of the bush. And I started to get a little bit worried. And then I saw a corner. And you don't get corners in bushes. So I thought to myself, well, I'll look around the corner, and if I don't see anything, I'm going to have to go backwards and come back out the same way. I was too big to turn around inside the bush. I would have had to have crawled backwards. So anyway, I stuck my head around the corner and I saw a light at the end. And I thought, well, I'm either going to see the cliff at the end of the light because I could see the sunshine, or I'm going to be somewhere else. So I crawled around the corner and I crawled quickly towards the light. And when I got to the end, there was no cliff. I stood up. And I was the first thing I remember feeling was really happy that I got through to the other side. But then I took a step back into the bushes, because when I looked up, the sky was purple. And when I looked down at my feet, there was no snow on the ground, there was grass, but the grass was blue. And then I heard some squawking sounds, and I watched as 4 huge birds flew past. But they weren't flying past as birds would normally fly past. These birds were flying backwards, and I watched as they disappeared over the trees. And I looked down at the trees where the birds had disappeared to, and these trees were tiny, and they seemed to have huge vegetables growing on them. It looked a little bit like bananas. So I found a stick, and I pushed the stick into the ground so I would remember where the hole was, and I followed a little path down the hill to where the trees were. And as I walked, I noticed something very strange happening with the grass, because each grass seemed to be moving, piece of grass seemed to be moving by itself. And I stopped and watched my feet, and when I moved my feet over to one side, the grass seemed to lean on the top of my shoes, and when I moved my feet to the other side, each blade of grass seemed to lean and rest itself on my other feet. And I watched as I moved my feet back and forth, thinking, this is amazing. It's like each piece of grass is alive. Anyway, I walked back down to the little tree, and sure enough, there were these huge pieces of fruit growing on them that looked very much like a banana. They were even yellow. And I was hungry and also a little bit curious. Even though I'd had my sandwich, I was still hungry from all the walking I'd done. So I picked one of these pieces of fruit, which was very easy because the tree was so small, and I sat down and I peeled it. And I took a huge bite out of it, and it tasted amazing. It was very sweet, a little bit like a banana, but it tasted like something I'd never tasted before, so it's very difficult for me to describe it to. But the only thing I can think it tasted a bit like was chocolate, kind of a little bit like a chocolate milkshake, because as soon as you took a bite, it started melting in your mouth. And I'd finished about half of this when suddenly I jumped up, because there standing in front of me was a little man. And it wasn't the little man that I'd seen in my garden. This little man was dressed differently, and he seemed to be really angry, because he had his hand on his face and his eyes were bunched up, and he looked at me and he said, "How dare you eat my triton?" And I said, I'm really sorry, what's a triton? And he said, "You're eating it." And he said, "Don't you know these trees belong to me?" And before I could say anything, he turned around and he disappeared into the trees. So I quickly put the triton down and I followed him. And again, even though he was walking, I was having trouble keeping up with him. And we came through the trees, and there was a beautiful little house, a tiny little house, with a very low roof. It had a fence with a little gate, and I just saw the man disappear into his house and slam the door. So I walked up to the house, I opened the small gate and walked down the path, and I knocked on his door, and he opened it straight away. And I had to kind of kneel to talk to him. And I said to him, listen, first of all, I'm really sorry that I took one of your pieces of fruit. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it belonged to you. And he said, well, what do you want anyway? You shouldn't be here. And I said, well, where am I? And he said, well, you're in Cuckoo Land. And I said, Cuckoo Land? He said, yes, Cuckoo Land. And he said, I'm guessing you came through the hole. And I said, well, yes, I did come through a hole. And I said, and I'm looking for a little person that was in my garden this morning. And he said, that must be Broccoli. And that's, of course, where the name comes from. And I said, Broccoli, that's a very strange name, because where I come from, that's a type of vegetable. And he said, well, that's broccoli. And he's going to be in huge trouble if he gets caught. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, don't you know anything? The head man is the man who looks after us in Cuckoo Land, and he's told us that none of us are allowed to go through the hole. We have to stay in Cuckoo Land. So if he gets caught, he's going to be in big trouble. So I said to this little man, do you think I could meet Broccoli? And he said, well, that shouldn't be too hard, but be careful, because if the head man finds out you're here, you're going to be in trouble. And I said, well, where does Broccoli live? And he said, we'll go back to the tree with the tritons on, and you'll see another little path that goes around the edge of the trees. You're going to cross over a small river, and Broccoli's house is on the other side. So that's exactly what I did. I found the river really quickly, but I had to stop at the river because when I looked down at the water, it was green and there were fish in it. And the fish were tiny. And they seemed to be playing a game with me, because when I looked over the side of the bridge, they were there looking up at me. Their eyes were on the top of their head. They were very bright. So I walked over to the other side of the bridge and looked over, and the fish had swum underneath the bridge and were waiting for me on the other side. And they were really just playing a game with me. So I walked back and forth, and each time I walked, the fish swam quickly under and were waiting for me when I looked down, and their little eyes were looking up at me. But I remembered that I had to find this little person that had been in my garden. So I quickly finished my game with the fish and walked over the bridge, and it wasn't long before I found Broccoli's house. And it looked very similar to the first house that I'd seen. And I walked up, I opened the little garden gate, and I knocked on the door. But there was no answer. So I knocked again, and there was still no answer. So I walked around to the back of his house, and there was Broccoli. And Broccoli was sitting inside his house with the window open. He had his feet in a bowl of water, and he was sneezing really loudly. And I was really worried that I was going to frighten him again, because if he looked up and saw me, he was sure to run away from me again into his house. So I took a step back and I said in a very quiet voice, Broccoli. And Broccoli looked up, and sure enough, his eyes grew wide with fright, and he jumped up, he knocked the bowl of water over, and he disappeared somewhere in his house. And I thought to myself, I'm not going away until I've spoken to this little guy. So I walked round to the front of his house, and I knocked again on his door. There was no answer. So I turned the handle and pushed the door open. And I realised that if I made myself very small, I could squeeze through the door. So that's what I did. And it was a bit naughty, really. I shouldn't have really been going into someone else's house. But I thought to myself, well, he knows who I am and that I want to talk to him. So maybe I'll just have a quick look around. When I got into his house, it was kind of strange because I could almost stand up. and the house looked very small from the outside. And although I had to bend my head to move around, I didn't have to get down too low, and I was able to walk around. And the first place I looked was upstairs. It didn't take me long to find his bedroom because it was so bright. He had a bright blanket on his bed, very similar to his jacket. And thinking that he was hiding in his wardrobe, when I opened it up, it was full of bright clothes. Dark pants, but very, very bright tops. And I realised he must have had about at least 2 or 3 different rainbow jackets. But I realised very quickly, if he was far hiding from me, I was never going to find him. There were just too many hiding places. So although I was calling out for him, I came back downstairs and I sat in his kitchen and wondered what to do next, when I saw a door moving. And it was a door where he must have kept his pots and pans underneath the sink, because it was open very slightly and it was moving. And then I saw a little hand around the edge of the door, and I realised he'd climbed inside the cupboard. So I said to him in a very quiet voice, "Broccoli, I just want to talk." And very slowly the door opened and out came Broccoli, and I got a good look at him. And he sat down, and I saw his bright rainbow jacket, and I saw his long red hat which he hadn't taken off. And then he started sneezing again. And the first thing I remember I said to him was, "Broccoli, you've got a cold." And he said to me, "What's a cold?" And I said, "You don't know what a cold is?" So I explained to him how your body feels when you have a cold. And I said, "I think you're getting sick, Broccoli." And he said to me, "What's sick?" So I said to him, "Don't you guys ever get sick in Cuckoo Land?" And Broccoli said to me, "How come you know about Cuckoo Land and my name?" So I explained to him about the first little person that I'd met. And then I had to explain to him what sick meant and what a cold was. And then I realised that Broccoli had got sick because he'd come through the hole into Austria, where we were in the middle of winter and it was very cold. You needed warm clothes. There was deep snow on the ground, and Broccoli had caught a cold because he wasn't warmly enough dressed. So I said to him, "Broccoli, I can make your cold better. I can get you some medicine." And then of course I had to explain what medicine was. And he said, "Well, that's very kind of you. When can I get it?" And I said to him, "Well, Broccoli, why don't you meet me tomorrow morning, sit on the tree stump again, and I'll go to the chemist and I'll get you some medicine." And he said, "Sure." And that was really the first time we met each other. So we said goodbye to each other, and I went back the same way I came. My stick was still in the ground. I squeezed back into the hole and went back into Austria, and I slid all the way down the mountain, and I was feeling very happy with myself. And I went to the chemist, to the pharmacy, and I asked for some medicine. And I knew the chemist because where I lived was a very small village. And I remember him saying to me, "Is this for your daughter Hannah?" And it was then that I realised. I stopped because I thought to myself, if I start telling people about this little elf that I've met called Broccoli, nobody's going to believe me. And even if they did, would they start looking for him? That was the last thing that I wanted to happen. So I told a lie, which I wasn't very proud about. But I told him the medicine was for my baby daughter Hannah. And he was quite worried. And we talked a little bit about what was wrong with her. And I told him that she really just had a cold and we wanted something for the cold. So he gave me a little bottle with a plastic spoon and told me to give her 2 spoonfuls every day. So I paid for the medicine and I went home. And the following day when I woke up, there was Broccoli waiting for me. And I went outside with a little bottle of medicine and the plastic spoon, and for the first time since I'd seen him, met him, he didn't run away from me. And we stopped and we talked to each other, and I explained to him how the medicine worked, and he put it in his rainbow jacket. He pushed himself off the tree stump and he stood next to me, and he probably only came up to just above my knees, even though he was standing up to his waist in snow. I could see how small he was. And he started walking to the back of the garden. And as he got, just before he squeezed through the bushes, I said to him, "Hey, Broccoli, do I get to see you again?" And he said, "Oh, you can come and visit me whenever you like." And after that, we started having quite a lot of adventures together. And maybe I'll have time, maybe the next story time, or the following one, I will tell you the next time that I met Broccoli and the adventure that we had together. So I hope you enjoyed the story this week. I hope you're keeping safe, and I look forward to seeing you next time.